My name is Eric Hines. I'm curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image, and I welcome you to this week's Reverse Shot Happy Hour. It is Friday, August 21st, if you're tuning in live. If you're watching the recording of it, you should know that this was recorded on Friday, August 21st. This has, for those of you who've been here before, you might feel similarly. This is one of the things I look forward to most every week, is gathering together with friends here and also friends from afar, friends who gather here in this space, but also friends who are just simply joining us to tune in and to be part of a really engaging and for me at least personally important conversation to be had about film, about culture, about the state of things. So again, thank you for joining in, and thank you for the support that you might be giving to the museum during this time. We've been relying on donations over these months to keep ourselves staffed and to start moving towards the future. And in the present tense, we have opened a drive-in in Corona, Queens, along with New York Hall of Science and Rooftop Films, and we are about to begin our second weekend of programming there, and just want to do a shout out to the documentaries that we're doing this week and next week, which is David Ossett's The Mayor is playing tonight, and next week Cecilia Alderondo's Landfall, two films that I think are extraordinary films that should have been touring the world in the festival circuit right now, that have not had a chance to do so, really, except for events like these. So if you're in the New York area and you have access to a car, please join us. Otherwise, the fact that you have access to Zoom and the internet means that you're able to join us for the happy hour. And I'd love to introduce the hosts of the Reverse Shot Happy Hour, longtime editors and the founders of Reverse Shot, Michael Koresky and Jeff Reichert, and contributing writer and filmmaker, Farihah Zaman. Give me 1 second, folks. Too busy talking.
Hey, Eric.
I know.
Sometimes I feel like yelling your name because it feels like I've been in this dark tunnel. So I talk a lot. Hey, Eric. Making fun of me.
No, that actually felt really celebratory. It was nice.
No, it's good to see you all.
I love watching a wildly bearded man scream into the void.
That is a wild, I mean, we can't stop talking about it. It is a wild beard and a wild man.
I've got nothing on Brody, guys. So let's
Is that what you're aiming for? Are you trying to out Brody?
Well, I want to, if I can leap past Brody and head right to Rasputin, I'll be pretty excited.
You're definitely at Boudou level. So.
Who's going to start drowning?
I'll see you guys in a little bit.
Excellent Boudou reference.
Hey, Jeff.
How are you guys doing?
You know, it's Friday.
Which is like
difficult week.
Day.
Well, Friday used to be celebratory, which I think is one of the reasons why we figured let's do this on Fridays, but days and time don't feel the same. So I think that we're taking all this into consideration and our just tired bodies.
Jeff and I both know that you have a special Friday dinner ritual, and I just look at your Instagram feed and slobber, and because we're neighbors, like a dog outside of a butcher shop, I'm like, maybe they'll throw me a bone. Maybe they'll bring over cake. And you often do. I appreciate that, but I'm glad you have a nice Friday night ritual to like give time a sense of meaning again.
That's true. Very briefly, my husband makes amazing food on Fridays. It's a delight. All I have to do is sit here like an idiot talking about movies, and then when this ends, I venture into the other room and there's just a smorgasbord waiting.
It appears you're rewarded for your labors.
I am.
Well, I know you guys wanted to talk about a new column that is making waves at reverseshot.org.
Yeah, we actually have two housekeeping things before we get into the show. I mean, the first, should we do the happy hour change or should we do the column first?
Column first.
Column first. Okay, we, at Reverse Shot, we've always really wanted to find a way to cover new media, new motion image-based visual media. And we've never quite found the right person to do it, never have had just sort of a continuous presence doing it. We had a great piece ages ago by Sean Flynn, who's one of the programmers at the Camden Film Festival, called Sensory Stories, which was looking at a program in New York of just sort of like immersive media installations and that we thought that was going to be a model for going forward and just kind of never quite took off. But Chloe Lizotte, who has been a longtime Reverse Shot contributor since 2016, I think, has published a new piece today, and it actually came kind of out of a happy hour because we had her on for Independence Day talking about things that were exciting and inspiring to her. And she started talking about the videos of this guy, Connor O'Malley, who I was not familiar with. And then she pitched us on running a piece, and it was great. And we said, well, would you like to keep doing this? And so it's going to be called Event Horizon. And I think we're going to run it maybe once a month, maybe twice a month, depending on what Chloe is able to dig up for us. I'm going to put a link to the piece in the chat, which is great. And also she links to a lot of Connor's video works, which are hysterical. Just really just wonderful, wonderful bombs in this moment. If bomb is the right word.
Well, they're also incredible. They're disturbing, and I wouldn't call them bombs. It's an interesting choice because they're sort of sifting through the debris of our contemporary nightmare culture. So if you consider that a bomb, that's interesting. But the piece is a bomb because the essay is just so fabulous. So we're really happy about that.
We'll actually have Chloe on next week and can talk more about that particular piece then. So you have an opportunity to read it before we have her on. It made me think of something that it's not a recent film, but I watched recently, which is Fresh Buzz. And it's one of Corey Archangel's pieces that are about corporate websites. So he did one for Dunkin' Donuts and one for Subway. And this idea of like how like, you know, that old phrase of giving someone enough rope to hang themselves by. So it's literally just an hour of like a guided surf of the website, and how just the material contained within that universe says so much about, in this case, like corporate America. And I think it's interesting to that just putting that content in a timeline like is also a way of creating cinema. Have either of you watched any of these Corey Archangel pieces?
No, I mean, it's embarrassingly no. My husband has, and he talks about them all the time.
So it's still available. I think it's screened as a online as a collaboration between Screen Slate and Rhizome.org. So I think it's still available if people wanted to check it out. It was a great hour of dinner viewing as I looked at images of like the disgusting but painstakingly photographed lunch meats of Subway.
Oh, nice. I wanted to give one more shout out that also, since we're talking about new writing this week, Badatri Chowdhury, who was on last 2 weeks ago. I don't remember how long. I can't, as I said, there's no such thing as time anymore. A recent guest on Happy Hour has a really wonderful new piece on Reverse Shot, which is all about female collective documentary film work. And it's inspiring and well-researched and really fascinating stuff. So another piece to look out for. Oh, there she is. And she's watching today.
Yeah. I'm glad you bring up the piece because it relates to at least the start of our talk today, the guests we have on, and the themes we're sort of exploring. I want to say real quickly, though, the other piece of housekeeping is that we're experimenting with moving Happy Hour to Wednesday starting next week. So if you enjoy this, enjoy it sooner than a week from now. We'll be doing the same time, so 5 p.m. Eastern Standard, same place. You can RSVP via the MOMI website. But we just thought that it might give, now that people are sort of wrapping their heads around how to like socialize or have a weekend or define their work time, we thought it might be nice to try it, try and offer a break and a time that's a little bit more available to people. So please continue to join us and tell your friends. What I was alluding to in sort of taking Vedatri's article as a jumping off point for today's talk, we're going to start a little bit with our first guest talking about representation or lack thereof in the documentary community. I think obviously there's been a lot of conversations about race and representation, and I actually think the hopeful part of me thinks in ways that are more nuanced and with an eye towards kind of like day-to-day slights that have gone ignored. But I do think that sometimes doc is left out of this conversation because it tends to be better, because we tend to have more women and more BIPOC behind the camera, but it doesn't mean that there don't continue to be issues. And in fact, sometimes people hide behind "it's better" as a way of not having to investigate what could continue to grow and improve. And from that, we're going to kind of talk about what's the positive side of that? What are examples of films where we feel that the filmmaker's perspective and the community that they come from, and that their identity shaped what the movie is in ways that we really appreciate, and why it's meaningful in those cases. So the theme is perspective. And our guests today, first we're going to have on Geeta Gandbhir, who is a filmmaker and editor. And we also have joining us a little bit later, Ela Bittencourt, who is a critic, reverse shot contributor, and a curator. So we're really excited to bring on Geeta to start.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you all for having me.
Geeta, that was one of the fastest like unmute on camera times that I've seen. I was really impressed. I always like hold my breath.
I was actually panicking because I didn't get the invite to start my video, and I was like, oh no.
No,
like,
we can tell you're a pro and you're very technically.
And leave an awkward, like, yeah, I didn't want there to be an awkward space where you guys are waiting for me.
How are you doing? Where are you during?
So I'm good.
this
I'm
time?
actually out of the city for the first time since March. You know, I think I left for 1 weekend, but we finally, myself and my family, finally were like, this, you know, if we don't go now, it's never happening. You know, so we're just left. We're just upstate New York, so for a couple of days.
I'm really glad you get that break. And I know you, as a parent, you're probably dealing with so much stress around this question of schooling and what to do with your children.
Yeah, I think we've sort of made our decision around what we're gonna do, but I think it's really hard. It's really, I think my heart really lies with the teachers and the administrators. I mean, it's such an unfair, undue burden, and for particularly public schools, which my kids attend, they already, you know, things are so hard. They are already underfunded and underserved, and this is just another, you know, a blow. So I feel like we have to support them as much as we can, you know.
And so tied into the other kinds of like questions and provocations that are happening. And I think sometimes people don't realize that, like,
no. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, we wanted to have you on for a number of reasons. We've collaborated before. You're a filmmaker that I just respect so much. And in addition to the contributions that you make to our field with your work, you've also been, you know, pretty active in the community itself. Like, how do we talk about who we are and who's allowed to make work? And, you know, one of the sort of starting place I wanted to come from is, you know, you, well, both of us like sort of find ourselves in having this more public conversation around representation in doc as a result of, you know, some higher profile projects that it felt impossible not to point out could have better, more inclusive voices from within the community. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Like, what is this conversation? What's been going on around this in the last few weeks, and what activated you?
Sure. So I think, well, I mean, I think ever since, so I began my career specifically with Spike Lee and Sam Pollard, and you know, I came up at 40 Acres and Emil Filmworks, which was a bit of course, you know, I'm not going to say it wasn't sometimes a challenging environment. We worked hard. It was hard, you know, but at the same time, it was sort of its own microcosm of, you know, an incredibly diverse, the teams were always incredibly diverse. Spike and Sam both really made a point to make sure there was representation, and sort of anti-racist practices were in place on the productions that I at least worked on. And so that was, I think, something that I grew up in. And then when in leaving that sort of, you know, that bubble of 40 Acres and Emil Filmworks, and coming outside of it, there were, obviously I saw a different world. Again, not that I didn't work with and haven't worked with my whole life with the most amazing, well-intentioned people, absolutely. But I think because we're, you know, we've inherited a system that is inherently white supremacist, you know, and anti-Black, and that's also the world we live in general. And I think since it's sort of the fabric of our life, the air we breathe. Really, we have to, in everything we do, we have to think about how we are either reinforcing it or dismantling it. And I think for in my whole career, that's been, something that I've struggled with. And oftentimes, like many people, have not necessarily been in the position of power, a position of power to affect any kind of change around it. Oftentimes, being the only person of color on a team, or not being, again, seen, being crew, not being in a position that was high enough where your voice actually made a difference. I think in recent years, as we have been, as you know, we've been organizing, BIPOC folks have been organizing on our own and sort of trying to build our own power outside of the sort of the main structure that exists for filmmaking, again, which often, unfortunately can reinforce these sort of patriarchal white supremacist roles. I think that power is now, as we've been building that power and working together in community, we are finding, it's been helpful in finding our voices, obviously, and the ability to support each other. There are many organizations like Brown Girls Doc Mafia, like Firelight, like, the BDC, the Black Documentary Collective, ADOC, right, the Asian Documentary Collective, or forgive me if I'm mangling the name, but ADOC. So essentially, I think now with all this sort of alignment and work we've done internally and outside of the system, I think the response to the system, right now, particularly in lives of the growth of the Black lives, in the face of the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, it just seems like the time is absolutely critical now. It's always been critical, but I think it's sort of it's come to a point where I think we as BIPOC folks can no longer really tolerate sort of some of the ways of working that we have in the past. And we also have what we see too now, which is really heartening, is with the Black Lives Matter movement, we see incredible allyship from other communities, and particularly like for example, just in the streets on these marches that we've seen, which are historically it's the largest movement, civil rights movement that we've actually seen historically over this last time period. The 60% of people in the streets who are at these marches are not African American, are other. So the idea of that kind of support, it feels like that even makes it more heartening and makes it feel like the time is really right to sort of impact change that we need to dismantle the system and move forward in a different way.
Well, and I think that it's like a reckoning is occurring. And we're seeing an opportunity to talk about that within a space that we have, that we spend most of our time. And I think it's not just like that the world is, I think a lot of it is about like what the response is as well. So for example, like I think what forced a lot of conversation to the forefront for us in the last few months was that you made a public statement around a film that we all felt a little disappointed didn't have better representation among their above the line crew, and I can imagine that like 10 years ago you'd just be labeled as a complainer basically, and instead,
I wouldn't have said it 10 years ago. I wouldn't have been frightened, like honestly. And I think about it, I mean, the truth is there are many folks who do feel that the repercussions of speaking out are that you will lose your job, that you won't work again, that if you bring up this issue, because and right now too, I have to mention, we are also living in one of the most polarized times outside of maybe our little, doc community. In the greater world, the issues of race have polarized our nation. And we have a lack of leadership, I like to say, not even leadership, but a lack of leadership that is absolutely touting, white supremacist ideology, and in a very frightening way. So I think for us, it also has come to a point too where it's no longer just, microaggressions that we feel like it's never been a microaggression, but the idea that we can kind of dismiss it. Right now, when we're talking about what's happening in the streets, it's a matter of life and death. Like, this is life and death for us. So within our community, which, like tends to be, to lean far, to the left, right? And also professes to be quite woke and very liberal. We have to also do the work of looking in the mirror and being like, where do we stand in this? Are we actually, working in solidarity and in allyship, or are we perpetrating the same system? These are the questions that I just feel like we need to raise. And I think raising them today is maybe more critical than it's ever been for all those additional reasons.
So I'm curious actually about the response to your speaking out about this particular project you mentioned. What has been the pushback, or the blowback rather?
So interestingly, I will say that the response has actually been far greater than first of all, as far as people who actually felt the same way and kind of backed up my question around, anti-racist practices. And, they asked to do better, around with projects, particularly, ideally all projects, but, if you want to like start somewhere, you should start with projects that are about us, right? But the statement is, and Farihah, what is it again? It's nothing about us without us. Like, that's really because we know documentary is traditionally a colonial exercise, right? What it is from, as is anthropology, right? It stems from like folks from one community, usually community like of European descent, oftentimes with like maybe greater power, systemic and structural power going into another community, and then talent taking, extractive filmmaking, possibly taking their stories. And not everyone does that, absolutely not. But the idea that there is the lack of inclusion of our voices in the telling of any stories, let alone our own, is what is, is what is so egregious and difficult to deal with. So, but the response from, I think the community has, for the most part, I would say been extremely positive. I think that obviously there is always some pushback, which, we have heard a number of things, some lend themselves to like, well, people shouldn't just be relegated to telling stories from their own communities. That's extremely limiting. And that's also, unethical. Like, why a good filmmaker should be able to tell anybody's story. I think we all agree with that. The issue is if it's an unequal playing field, then, then you're talking about an unequal playing field where the access and resources are only going to certain people. And that is a problem, and everyone else is shut out. So there has been some, it's an uncomfortable conversation. Let's be real. This shit is uncomfortable. Excuse me. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse, but it's uncomfortable. And
it's a very adult show.
Yeah, folks don't like it. You know what I mean? Nobody likes to have this conversation, and nobody wants to feel that they're on the wrong end of it. And the truth is, that's the other thing too. It's like, you don't want to, it's hard to feel that you're on the spot. But I think, but for the most part, I would think that everybody, the one thing I will say is I do feel that most of the people in our community want to be on the right side of this. They may not have the tools. They may not have done the work. They may not even be aware that they don't have the tools or haven't done the work. So it's like different people are starting from different places, but the willingness to move forward and to engage into it and to lean into it is really the beginning, and we're at the beginning of it with our community. So, it's a long way forward, but we can get there as long as we agree to do it together.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, there's a way in which those of us on the left and those in artistic communities on the left can often feel like, oh, well, we've arrived.
Yes, that's right.
But we have not.
No. And I just want to, you're absolutely right. I want to say too, like, I have to think about Farihah and I are both, South Asian women. I have often been chosen to work on films about people of color where I'm seen as adjacent, or just, I'm used as, I'm often, sometimes the brown person in the room who's everyone turns to. But that's not, I have to also say, no, this is not good enough. Like, you cannot use me. I can't be on a film about Muslim women and represent them, or, say that I'm the authority because I am actually not Muslim. And Farihah, we've talked about this, like there has to be representation. And also it just makes it a better, richer process. You know what I mean? Like I think the other thing too is to recognize the value that diversity, that term is so overused, but that people of different communities bring to your project.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's
and a better, for the viewer, like hopefully a better process that will result in a better film.
Exactly.
Viewing experience.
Exactly. Like authenticity, integrity, it's like all of those things will make a better film. So
I think a lot of people have an easy time agreeing with the statement, don't you want to hear from more people? Don't you want to hear from more voices? But then sometimes get stuck on the aspect where it's like, well, if you want that, it requires constant daily work and attention because we're not getting there naturally or organically. Look around you, it's not happening. So like it instead of like celebrate a victory, but don't sit on that laurel, like what more can we do should, I think, be a constant question. And I'm glad you brought up doc specifically because I think for people who are sort of interested in like how our recent conversation unfolded, I think the best sort of recounting is this IndieWire article that came out that sort of explained the circumstances that forced this conversation. And I think they touch on this, but it's something that I've thought about a lot in this time, is like our responsibilities ethically and morally differ. I don't have that view that like documentarians should be neutral, journalists are also not neutral, but like our responsibilities to these communities and who and how we represent them are different. And I think that that's part of why it matters so much to talk about like who's in the room and who gets to talk to people and who gets to bring stories back. And I think what the pushback showed in some of the comments in this, like any comments that are there are all about like, but it's a documentary, so like anybody can do it. That's how documentaries work. Which first of all, like, thanks for explaining to me how a documentary works. I really needed a middle-aged white man to tell me that in the context of an article in which we were discussing lived experience. So I think that people can get stuck around this idea of genre when like really that's part of why we need to push to like bring a greater range of voices to the table.
But and it is not exclusive to documentary. I mean,
No.
if you look at filmmaking in general, I mean, documentary is one aspect, right, of like the filmmaking community, but it is the entire filmmaking community. It's the entirety of everything, right? When you look at the executive level, particularly, it's also about funding and resources. Like who decides how the funding and resources get allocated? If you look at that, how many executives, high-level executives at sort of gatekeeping companies are, BIPOC people or, from the LGBTQ community? Like how many folks can you find that also represent, the films that are being made? And that's, so I think those, again, systemic racism just plays into everything, and unfortunately we have to look at it and weed it out wherever it goes, and wherever it grows, we have to literally, and like you said, it's a daily task. It's a pain in the neck, like it's not like cause everyone just wants to live their life, and but and everyone is people are comfortable in their lives, so it requires us to be willing to be uncomfortable. And I would say to, I think to a lot of folks who, as far as that is concerned, like whether or not you realize it, your friends who are from, a different community, particularly like a BIPOC community, are always contending with that discomfort. Mm-hmm. That discomfort is a daily reality. So good allyship is about, also leaning into that and maybe helping to bear that burden.
And I need your ears and your action more than I need your guilt is something that I would like to say out loud. One of the other interesting things that came up is like, because it is sometimes harder for us to, again, like sort of get in the room or be in a position of power, that conversely, then the response is like, that the problem is trying to address new filmmakers, emerging filmmakers, when that's, not there are a lot of people who have pushed through, BIPOC people, queer and trans people who like have been able to tell that. And I think it would be great to turn to like some of the voices that you really celebrate, where you're like, yeah, they got to make this movie, and I see in the DNA of this film what it meant, you know, for this person to helm that film.
Yeah, that's right. I think some of that too is also like thinking, if you are in a position where, you know, work comes to you, you know, thinking, am I the person to make this film? You know, am I really the person? Is there someone else who could maybe do this? Or, you know, sometimes it's about stepping aside, you know, or, you know, making sure that you, again, your team is properly staffed, or, you know, taking a producing role, not necessarily centering yourself, right? Like these are all things that are about good allyship that, and I think all of us have to practice. That includes me, you know, absolutely. We all have to do it.
A film of yours that I thought about so much in the last few months is, you made a New York Times op doc that I think I was like, Geeta, everyone should see this movie, called A Conversation with My Black Son. I was wondering if you could talk about that and like how your perspective and experience sort of played into making the film.
Sure. So I think, and it's interesting, it was 5 years ago, around the murders of Eric Garner and Michael Brown, you know, et cetera, the sort of endless string of murders of Black men. And there were obviously, you know, heated protests at that time. I was trying to think of something that I could do that wasn't, again, just aside from like crying every day over the news and going to protests. What could I do that was, you know, sort of use the skills that we have in our, you know, our community. And also, again, it felt so polarized, the situation. Again, when you would talk about, you know, again, as it still is today, policing and, you know, and police murders, it was such a challenging conversation to have. And I think, so a woman who is a dear friend and a colleague, Blair Foster, and I thought about making a film about what it means to raise a Black boy. And so my children are Black. I have 2 Black sons. And I think for me as well, it's just, you know, as parents, there is obviously this fear that we face if you're in raising a Black son, and a conversation you have to have with them about the police that I found that some of my white friends and colleagues were not aware of at that time. I think since then it's become much more a part of the news cycle, and just it's in the media, and it's in part of daily conversations about race. But back then I was surprised to find that, you know, folks who I knew who were I considered close friends didn't know what was happening in my house. And the conversations they were having with their kids were very different about the police, particularly if they were white. So we made a film, Blair and I, a short film that took the perspective of parents raising Black boys, and the experience of having to explain to them that the police could harm them, you know, and that how they had to be careful around the police. And then afterwards it turned into a series, and Blair and I were like, we cannot, you know, basically there was an ask for more from the New York Times, and Blair and I were like, we can't do this alone. And also too, we are no longer, we don't fit the demographic that needs to be part of telling this story. So we are not just amongst ourselves diverse enough, you know, like it's just, so we brought on other folks. We brought on other partners, were Jim Brewster, Michelle Stevenson, and Perry Peltz, to help us with the series. And we built a series on race, about conversations on race, just to try again to be trying to be like sparks, like conversation starters that would help people maybe navigate this tricky, for some reason still a very tricky subject, even though we deal with it every day.
I'm not one of those people who would draw a line in the sand and say unequivocally, like, if you come from a more privileged background, you're never allowed to tell the story of a community outside your own. I do think that series, and particularly your starting point, is one in which I felt the emotional resonance for you. Like, I felt that is something that you brought to the story. I'd love to bring in our next guest to keep talking about, you know, films in which perspective played a really important role that we are happy to see in the world. Ela Bittencourt, come on down.
And Ela is joining us from
also so fast.
Hi. You say come on down, and here I am. I swoop down from the skies.
These are we got pros on today.
Yeah, I like it.
We're so happy to see you.
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me on our happy hour. Yeah.
Jeff, you were saying?
I was just saying that Ella is calling in from Brazil, which I think is the furthest we've had anybody joining us from. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Furthest away. So welcome. How are things down there?
Dire. No, I mean, it's, you know what, in Brazil, I mean, it's odd and it's eerie, and it's how much Brazil, I mean, it's almost, there's sometimes this eerie feeling of how Brazil is on a parallel track with what's happening in the US, and how I'm in São Paulo, I'm São Paulo based, and my family's in New York, and it's just, I almost feel like it's unfolding for me simultaneously. Because I think some of the issues with obviously lockdowns, and I think Brazil is the second highest tracking in terms of the pandemic. So I'm following New York, but we're also always on the heels of what's happening in the US. And yeah, and having the same issues of having presidents and governments that are unwilling to talk about the deaths, that are unwilling to mention and to kind of have a gesture of grieving, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we are here.
And
Sorry, I feel like I'm bringing down the happy hour mood.
No, we can't talk to somebody from a friend of ours from Brazil and not ask how you are. It's very, very important.
Right.
Because I've been thinking a lot about what's going on down there. And also I've been very curious to know a little more about the situation with the Cinemateca down there. This has become, it's not as widely reported because not everyone cares as much about film culture perhaps as we do, but it's actually becoming a very big political nightmare. If you could elaborate a bit on what's happening.
Yeah, so Cinemateca is in a state of absolute emergency. And I think it's up to us to keep on insisting that it is an emergency, because I think, the government insisted that it must hand over the keys. There was a bit of there was a standoff essentially between the workers at Cinemateca, and a lot of them technicians, because this is one of the largest, or actually the largest archive in Latin America. So very much the heart of Latin American cinema, and it had something like 40 technicians actively working on preservation and on a restoration of films that, didn't want to abandon it for obvious reasons. I mean, we have had museums that have burned down in Brazil. There was a National Museum in Rio that burned down, and obviously everyone wants to prevent that happening in São Paulo with the Cinemateca. So it led to, there was a standoff when the workers were saying, no, we want to stay on site and we want to keep on taking care of the Cinemateca. But last year, the government actually canceled Cinematec's contract. So essentially, Cinematec was under an organization that was being given the funds from the government to then be able to pass it on, to pay the technicians, to keep the archive going, to have all the fire systems and all the preservation in place. And when the contract was broken, they found themselves with no funds. And then the organization that kept running it, they kept on trying to raise money somehow to run it, but they just can't do it. They absolutely couldn't do it without the funds from the government. And the government kept on insisting that we're just going to have to close it down. You're just going to have to hand over the keys. And then it essentially happened. I mean, it just recently happened. There was a representative of the government who I think is stand-in secretary of the audiovisual sector, who was on site in Cinematec and showed up with the federal police to kind of make the point of, you will hand over the keys and we will close down the Cinematec. Now, it's enormously complicated. There's a whole legal battle of essentially some legal counsel saying you can't just strike down an institution like Cinematec from your budget and pretend that it doesn't exist. But it's just, there's a great worry that on one hand, you have archives that are very fragile. You have nitrate films. You have something like 250,000 rolls of film that requires constant care. and obviously also requires the people who understand how to take care of this material to be there on site. And on the other hand, you have the government that is saying we will do something eventually, but we must restart the process. And there's just so much confusion, and this could drag on indefinitely, which was of course the greatest worry, is that the minute you hand over the keys and it's closed down, that it will start this whole process that will take God knows how long. And in the meantime, who is going to take care of this patronage? You know, who's going to take care of the archive? And it is cinema, but it's also literally Brazilian history, because it's enormous television archives, it's newsreels. I mean, just entire audiovisual and visual history of Brazil is in this place. And we don't know what will happen. Literally don't know what will happen with it.
What is the government's interest in trying to keep this space closed and unworking?
Enormously complicated. I mean, that's the other thing. I think everyone is hoping that this will generate is a broader discussion eventually once we are past this crisis, which unfortunately may drag on. I think the hope is that there will be a broader discussion of, when you have something like this, an institution of this importance, what safety net can you create around it to make sure that it doesn't become a pawn in the politics, right? Because I don't even know where to start with what happened with Cinematheque, but I think this government, since the very beginning, since Bolsonaro took over, as president, made it very clear that it's not interested in culture. So it's not just Cinematheque that came under fire, but various institutions came under fire for various reasons. For example, the funds for films in Brazil are also entirely frozen. So regardless of COVID, I mean, those funds are frozen. So even the filmmakers who had contracts and agreements that they want these grants and that they would receive them, they saw not a penny of them. Museums came under fire for other reasons, because they were offensive, because there was nudity, because they were not answering to, the Christian values and the conservative values, because they're just not. So it feels like it's an all-out assault. And Cinematheque, unfortunately, this is a tragedy of it, that an institution of this status and this important became embroiled in this, because there were various plans of, the gestures from the government that no, because Cinematheque, we would like to be able to do a retrospective of military films. No, because we would want Cinematheque in Brasilia, where the government is based. We would like to keep it under our control. We would like to be able to decide who's actually the director of Cinematheque. And so it's just this constant of, on one hand, disregard for culture, and on the other hand, this insistence that it must comply absolutely to our agenda. And if it doesn't, then that there are consequences, and we are seeing consequences. But I think as a critic also, it made me think about the importance of really talking about preservation and conservation and restoration, that I notice when I write about classic cinema retrospectives as critics, we don't always get to talk about what happened behind the scenes, how important the restoration process was, why it's so important that Cinematheque had 40 technicians, and the fact that even if you are arguing that you are starting a new legal procedure where you will have a new contract and you will have a new budget and you will hire everyone all over again, the truth is that there aren't that many technicians capable of even taking care of this material in the whole country, and that many of them were actually originally at Cinematheque and you just fired them because they all got fired.
Well, I think as you said,
in the middle
Ela,
of the pandemic, I mean, they were just all let go. They were all fired.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just want to reiterate that what you said is so true and really resonates for me, that cinema history is history. Like it's among the greatest reflections of the ways in which people have lived in the 20th century at the very least, ongoing, but particularly looking back at that time. And, as such, it makes sense that there's a desire for control over which narratives are told and what people are allowed to see.
No, absolutely. And of course, this is not unique to Brazil. You know, I'm Eastern European by birth. I watch what's happening in Poland. Is it very different? No, it's not very different. Actually, like the ultra conservative takeover in Poland looks very similarly. There's complete suppression of LGBTQ themes. There's just complete suppression of you know, of the freedom of speech. I mean, there's the same insistence of conforming to what are called the Christian values, and so on and so on. So Brazil is not unique, but you're right. I mean, and I think what's heartwarming, though, what I hear from filmmakers here, that it is heartwarming to hear from other parts of the world where it's being noticed that Cinematheque is under such enormous pressure, and that I think it's important that we keep insisting that this is a state of emergency, you know, so that this process doesn't drag out, so that there's some sort of sense of urgency.
Yeah.
And especially because, I mean, Cinematheque just suffered a flood. I mean, and it destroyed a good portion of its archive, actually, the flood. I think this whole problem with, you know, who's being let go and it closing and the stress this put on the institution, because this is from last year. We are talking about workers who are there trying to protect it without receiving salaries for 6 months. I think this led to the fact that, for example, there's no final report of what was lost in the flood and what's recoverable. So we don't even actually, at this very point, we don't know what state it is in, what's left, what's in real danger, considering that there's nitrate. You know, we know that there are days where their electricity was turned off. We know that there were days when their fire brigade went home because they're no longer under contract. I mean, there's just so much instability, and this is in the middle of the pandemic. So it's just, it's beyond frustrating. And it's tragic that it's happening in 2020. You know, Cinematheque has been around since 1940. It is its nice round anniversary. So, you know, something that we would hope to celebrate rather than grieve.
Like you were saying, this is not unique to Brazil. It's also not unique to the moment, right? I mean, if we think about how authoritarian governments have often operated, like since early part of the 20th century, one of the first things they come for in culture is the moving image. It's very, very, very powerful. I mean, just going back to Germany in the 30s.
And using the pandemic as an opportunity, as a way to take advantage, because people are home, because you can mask the real intentions of your actions with some idea of protection or financial tightening, or, you know, whatever is being cited. I wonder, Ela, if, like, I know it's difficult and probably painful at this time, but I would love for you to talk about some of the films that are part of the archive, or the work of any particular filmmakers that have been, you know, like most on your mind in recent months.
Yeah, and actually the part of the archive is what I am doing research on, because, you know, I'm kind of digging into, I mean, this is another thing. It's interesting because it's not as though Cinematheque wasn't doing all this work to put forward the, you know, for everyone to know about the work that it was doing. I mean, they have annual reports. They were doing retrospectives of restored materials. I mean, it's an absolutely gorgeous space. I work for the festival at Tudo Verdade Documentary Film Festival, which in English is It's All True, and Cinematheque was always one of the places that we showed. It's where I, you know, saw Eduardo Coutinho speak, one of its greatest documentary filmmakers. So, I mean, it's an archive, it's an educational space, it's a gathering space. And I'm hoping to do more of the research of, like, actually focusing on what it is that they have been restoring. One of the films, which is now playing on Criterion Channel, Mario Peixoto's Limite, a film from 1931, for example, is an example of preservation that I'm hoping to study in more depth. Because that was a collaboration between the Brazilian Cinemateca and the Cinemateca di Bologna.
Filmmaker?
Mario Peixoto.
Oh.
Mario Peixoto, and this is, I mean, actually, this is such a brilliant, the reason why I'm researching it, because it's such a brilliant case of preservation. I mean, this is a film that Mario Peixoto, in 1931, I think he was something like 22, 23 years old, had returned from London, gathered his friends, went to a fazenda, which is basically a farm, a family farm, and said, let's make a movie, right? And didn't know the technical craft was and made this gorgeous avant-garde film, which, you know, may remind you of some of the surrealist work of Dulac, which with Edgar Brazil, who's a very important modern cinematographer and photographer, German-born, who did cinematography for this film. But apparently, when it first shown, for example, this film in 1931, some considered it so scandalous. There are anecdotes of Peixoto of being kind of in the screening booth, and the audience just going wild and throwing things. And apparently, it was bad enough experience that he went on. Then there was an actress that he hired that was in this film that was a star. A studio star, and he wrote the next script for her, but she was having some kind of a personal crisis, and they started filming, they could never finish, and that was it. So Mario Peixoto basically tried to make a second film, but Limici is his only finished film, and this film disappeared then for like some 40 years. No one was watching this film, nobody was talking about it, and then in the 70s, critics started talking about it, and people started increasingly watching this mysterious film that nobody knew about. And and eventually, within a few years, it shot to being the #1 Brazilian film. I'm considered the most important Brazilian film in the history of Brazilian cinema. And then eventually it was restored. I forget which year it was restored. But I mean, this whole process and this idea of, if you don't have it in the archive, if you don't have something to work from, just this immensity of what we're losing. And in a country like Brazil, where, I mean, I think it's so great to hear Geeta talk about representation. I mean, I'm obviously, as a foreigner and as a white person, I'm merely an observer, but I have to say that one of the most hopeful things about Brazil and Brazilian cinema are precisely the discussions about representation, this sense of nothing about us without us, and we need a seat at the table in a country where more than 50% of the population identifies as Black or of mixed origin, which is so important. And I've been in Brazil for 5 years, and I just felt so privileged to witness that growth of Brazilian filmmakers increasingly showing up at festivals and saying, let's celebrate that you had Black actors. Let's celebrate that you actually went out to the communities and didn't make an exploitative film about us. Let's celebrate that we have more participation, but let's also be very clear and aware that we need more, and we have to do better, and we have to do more. And so so with that came this sense that increasingly, I mean, really, truly, every year I would come back to the festivals, there would be a new Black Brazilian critic, which would then or a new Black Brazilian curator, even more importantly, who would be part of the program, this kind of constant push. And there was also, I mean, the idea of quotas, right? That Brazil struggled with it, but there was quotas in education, which slowly started reshaping the Brazilian universities. And there was a quota, very recent quota in the audiovisual rules. I mean, the Ancine, which is basically the agency that gives all the funds to cinema, started a quota for Black Brazilian filmmakers and for Brazilian indigenous filmmakers that was just taking off, literally taking off, as this government took over and essentially did away with it. But we would hope, because I think it's a movement that's unstoppable. I think that, I mean, when I was in Rotterdam at the International Film Festival, and the Black Brazilian curator, Janaína Oliveira, did a program of Black Brazilian cinema. And I spoke to the filmmakers there. They were talking about how important it is that, for the first time at universities, for example, and within the cinema studies departments, you have Black filmmakers being formed. And this is 2020, right? So we're talking about 2015, maybe, when their generation made it for the first time through the door. And for the first time, there's pressure to talk about what do our cinema studies programs actually look like, and what's the percentage of the European cinema that's being shown versus our Black Brazilian cinema, African cinema that could be shown as a new model. So I mean, that kind of energy really has brought just, and I have to say that in Brazil, the same goes for LGBTQ cinema. That's the other just incredible. I mean, that explosion of LGBTQ cinema in Brazil is also just incredible wealth of styles, themes. I mean, gorgeous films have been made in the last 10 years. And it's all relatively new. And I think it is just, I truly believe that kind of energy is unstoppable. I think that's what's giving us hope every single day. That when we are past this crisis, and it is much more immense than COVID, it has a lot to do with governance. It has a lot to do with how this government sees culture and its absolute and complete disdain for it. But I think when we're through it, that energy is there and it's unstoppable. And I think it's going to bring back Brazilian cinema to festivals. I truly believe it, because there's just so much talent.
I feel so like uplifted by what you just said.
I started.
That was so wonderful, and I do feel that that's true. That like there's this like window of opportunity amidst like necessary chaos. And I also want to say again to your point about like the importance of restoration. Like I think that lasting change is looking forward and back, and so like renewing like attention on what exists in the canon. Absolutely. And the perspective that's existed is like actually a radical act. And it makes me laugh, the like image of like archivists and restorers as like, like whatever, nerds, whatever that word means. It's like, it's actually, it can be a really radical act, like depending on your politics to be like, actually, I'm helping reshape what we even see in terms of our national identity, our cultural identity, by like making these works accessible.
Well, also because the discussion of cinema studies departments, I mean, it has just opened, and it's not just cinema, obviously, it's also literature. I don't know, there was this article in the New York Times of how there was this whole discussion in Brazil for how many years Machado de Assis had a photograph of himself as a essentially white person and not a Black writer, right? And he's an essential, fundamental Black Brazilian writer. So, and he's just one writer. I mean, there are just so many. I think with the reshaping of the cinema departments, preservation and restoration becomes even more important, and the archive is even more important, because we know that there's so much material there. We know that there are Black Brazilian filmmakers who probably got to made, smaller films, more fragile films, but films that are enormously valuable that we now need to recover and bring to the audience so that our curricula can be reshaped, so that our retrospectives can look different. Because I think we can all agree, I think this is the good news. I think that when this crisis is over, because now in the midst of crisis, we're so blindsided, it doesn't seem like there's any conversation happening. But I think when we passed it, I think we'll return to the idea that wouldn't we all be richer, that we all agree that the richer, that the more diverse the stories being told, we're all so much wealthier for it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's my hopeful note.
Wonderful to end on a note of hope. And welcome back, Eric, who appeared out of the dark, as he always does.
He's like, now that the mood has shifted, I guess I can handle it.
That was amazing. This is absolutely amazing. Yeah, both segments here. I'm so appreciative of what you brought to the conversation today. And I actually wanted to wait as late as I could go to show up, because I actually didn't want to cut into any of this, because it's just there's a lot for us to be taking in and to be thinking about right now. I mean, in general in our lives, but I think in this hour, just incredibly valuable time.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, it's both of the sort of entry points for the conversation from Geeta and Ela. Like, I'm sure everyone has these days during this time in particular, if you work in the arts, when you're like, why do I do this? What is the contribution that I'm making to the world? Like, what am I even doing that has value? And like, in hearing other people talk about it, I'm reminded that like, it helps shape what we can imagine is possible.
Well, I mean, and that's what I was going to. It's funny that where Ela, you took it, you bravely took it to this other place, which is exactly what my question was going to be, which is in a moment when we are, when we're having where culture and film is being threatened, in an authoritative. There's some sort of tension with an authoritarian government in terms of devaluing culture, period. And then at the same time, trying to have incredibly important and belated reckonings about who gets to make the films and what representation behind them. And there's a way in which you worry about the timing of that, of somehow one contradicting the other, or one sort of forestalling the energy of the other. And that's a fear of mine, that sense of like, are we strong enough to withstand this? Because there's two different elements of pressure and friction here. So to hear you're talking about in terms of Brazil, like, no, there is actually this unstoppable force in terms of momentum, in terms of how people are approaching making the art, even though there's this authoritarian boot heel down, it's actually not going to stall the momentum towards making films this way, which is incredibly valuable to hear, because that is the fear in some ways of like the necessary change being forestalled by such a systemic pressure.
No, I truly believe that. And I also believe, I think, there's a lot to be said about physical medium, obviously, versus only digital. But I truly believe that the filmmakers who have been working in Brazil for these past few years or the past decades, I think they have laid the foundations for the future. The way that, for example, cinema marginal, that was also existing in this authoritarian context under extreme conditions, set, and it was happening in the 1970s, also lay the foundation for the future and for the democratic process. So in that sense, I truly believe it is unstoppable.
Would it be too earnest of me to toast to the future?
No, we need that, especially.
We need it.
I'm really feeling it right now.
We need it.
I'm just radioactive lemonade today.
Fluorescent.
Radioactive.
To a better future.
To a better future.
Onward. Cheers.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
This was a really wonderful conversation.
Quick shout out, thank you to those who've joined us that are in the Reverse Shot community: Badachi Chaduri, Chris Wisniewski, Devika Girish, Jordan Kronk, Justin Stewart, Ryan Swen, Kelly Weston, and Leo Goldsmith. And thank you, the rest of you, friends or just continued loyal viewers. Thanks for tuning in and joining us, and I hope you'll join us next Wednesday.
Wednesday's the new Friday, as someone said in the comments.
What day is it? That's really
yeah. Time has no meaning, so have a drink on Wednesday. See you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.